You're listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We believe the Bible doesn't need to be watered down or cleaned up to be understood. Our goal is to provide a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. I'm your host, Colin Connor. Now, on to the episode. Welcome everyone to the final episode of the main body of our Exodus series. We have made it through almost 12 chapters now, and that is quite a way to come considering all of the material that was in there. By now, you probably know more about the first 12 chapters of Exodus than you ever wanted to. But we are not quite done yet because we do have to finish chapter 12, and there are some really fascinating discussions that we are going to get into this week that I'm pretty confident you will not hear in church when you cover these chapters. Chapter 12 is the pivot point for the book of Exodus. This is the night where everything changed. This is the night where the cosmic order, the Ma'at order of Egypt, got flipped upside down, when slaves became free, and when the god of a small nomadic family said, "Hold my beer," and took on an entire Egyptian pantheon at once. And here's the thing. This story is not just a bunch of chapters about ancient Israelite history. This is a story about power, about who really controls nature, and about what it means to be rescued not from God, but by God, from the forces of death itself. So settle in, because we are about to unpack one of the most complex, beautiful, and, dare I even say, disturbing passages in all of Scripture. Let's get started. Let's go ahead and read from verse 12, where we left off last week, down through verse 28. God is still speaking to Moses here, and he says, "For I will pass through the land of Egypt this night, and will smite all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. And against the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am Yahweh. And the blood will be to you for a token upon the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and the plague will not be upon you to destroy you when I smite the land of Egypt. And this day will be to you for a memorial. You will keep it a feast to Yahweh through your generations. You will keep it a feast by an ordinance forever. 7 days you will eat unleavened bread. Even the first day you will put away leaven from your houses. For whoever eats leavened bread from the first day until the seventh day, that soul will be cut off from Israel. And in the first day there will be an holy convocation." I love the King James language there. "In the seventh day there will be a holy convocation to you. No manner of work will be done in them, save that which every man must eat, that only may be done of you. And you will observe the feast of unleavened bread. For in this selfsame day have I brought your armies out of the land of Egypt. Therefore this is why you will observe this day in the generations by an ordinance forever. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month at evening, you will eat unleavened bread, until the 21st day of the month at evening. 7 days there will be no leaven found in your houses. For whoever eats that which is leavened, even that soul will be cut off from the congregation of Israel, whether he be stranger or born in the land." You can definitely see some repetition here at this point. Verse 20. "You will eat nothing leavened. In all your habitations you will eat unleavened bread." So Moses called for all the elders of Israel and said to them, "Draw out and take you a lamb according to your families, and kill the Passover. You will then take a bunch of hyssop, dip it in the blood that is in the basin, and strike the lintel, that's the top bar of a door, and the 2 side posts with the blood that is in the basin. And none of you will go out of the door of his house until the morning. For Yahweh will pass through to smite the Egyptians. And when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the 2 side posts, Yahweh will pass over the door, and will not suffer the destroyer to come into your houses to smite you. And you will observe this thing for an ordinance to you and to your sons forever. And it will come to pass, when you be come into the land which Yahweh will give you, according as he has promised, that you will keep this service. And it will come to pass, when your children will say to you, 'What do you mean by this service?' that you will say, 'It is the sacrifice of Yahweh's Passover, who passed over the houses of the children of Israel in Egypt, when he smote the Egyptians and delivered our houses.' And the people bowed their heads and worshipped. And the children of Israel went away and did as Yahweh had commanded Moses and Aaron, so did they." All right, I know that was a long selection of verses there, but there was definitely some repetition, so I don't think it'll take us quite as long to get through the notes for those verses as you might think. Starting back in verse 12, I will point out that we have this word for passing through the land. God says that he's going to pass through the land of Egypt. It does mean to pass over something, but that is not the Pesach, or Passover related word that we get later in the chapter. So even though it is translated that way in English, and it is a legitimate translation, it is a synonym for the word that is actually Passover. It is not actually the same word here. Now, you may remember, if you listened to last week's episode, that I pointed out that back in chapter 11, in verses 3 through 5, God says that he is going to personally inspect the land of Egypt, but he does not himself say that he will kill anybody in that. He just says that the firstborn will die. He does not take agency for that there in chapter 11. However, here in verse 12 of chapter 12, he says, I will pass through the land of Egypt this night and will smite all the firstborn of the land. So this is now putting the killing of the firstborn on Yahweh himself. So we have a little bit of a difference between those verses. I'm going to leave that hanging for the moment because we are going to come back to this issue of who is killing the firstborn when a couple verses later it gets even muddier. So just hang on to that thought for the moment being. Some commentators have actually looked at this verse and thought that this idea of executing judgment against the gods of Egypt meant that Egyptian idols would be smashed as Israel left Egypt. But I don't believe that's the point, and that's not a very popular view among scholars. These signs were a direct attack on the Egyptian pantheon of very real spiritual beings. In our very materialistic Western context, we tend to read about the gods in the Bible and just assume they're stand-ins for the idols. It's just talking about these lifeless idols that people worship made of stone and wood and all that. But that's not the way that the ancients would have understood this. The people in the times of the Bible, the people who wrote the Bible, really thought that these beings existed. Not just that they were idols, but that the idols represented real supernatural beings. And this actually is the view of the Bible itself. It sounds really weird to us today because we're not used to thinking that way. But if you look carefully throughout the Bible, the assumption is that there are truly other small g gods that exert a measure of power. And this goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 11 with the Tower of Babylon incident, when God separated up the nations there into roughly 70 groups. The tradition became that he assigned a specific divine being in his council. This is an idea that the Israelites brought over from other Canaanite groups in the area that they lived in, where the main god would have a pantheon of deities that served him, a council of other supernatural beings that would give insight into how he should rule. And so they adopted this idea. This is not something you're going to hear in most churches, but it is here in the Bible. We even find this in Deuteronomy chapter 32, and it's a reference all the way back to the Genesis 11 Tower of Babylon incident. Now, depending on the version of scripture that you have, it may read a little bit differently. It may say that God divided up the nations according to the sons of Israel. We don't have time to get into why that is not a great translation here in this episode, but hopefully we'll talk about in the future. And if you're interested in more information than I can give in this limited time, I would highly recommend the work of Michael Heiser. He has so much on this topic. It's a whole rabbit hole that you can go down. He was a reputable scholar who really took this stuff seriously and also was a very conservative, biblical, literalistic scholar. So he wasn't just making up something here. He was trying to follow the Bible very closely. And so in that Deuteronomy 32 passage, it says actually that God divided up the nations according to the number of the sons of God, which should have you thinking of Genesis 6, the supernatural beings that came down and had sex with human women. So the idea is that at the Tower of Babylon, God separated up these nations into roughly 70 groups and put a divine council member over each one. And then if you look in a couple of the Psalms, the idea seems to be that they went rogue, started taking worship for themselves. Instead of serving Yahweh, they became rebellious supernatural beings, the gods of the nations. And this isn't just some weird theory. I mean, it is right here in Scripture. We even find it again in Numbers 33:4, talking about Exodus. For when the Egyptians buried all their firstborn, which Yahweh had smitten among them, upon their gods also Yahweh executed judgment. So as uncomfortable as that can make us feel, this was a supernatural showdown between the God of this nomadic people, Israel, and the gods of Egypt. And it wasn't just, oh, the one true God against a bunch of useless idols. These were actual supernatural beings with actual supernatural power, and Yahweh was showing them to be nothing compared to him. Now, some of you may have heard before that each of these plagues was against one particular Egyptian god. I definitely learned this growing up. An example of this would be the second plague with the frogs, where sometimes preachers would point to an ancient Egyptian goddess named Hecate who had the head of a frog in depictions. And they would say, okay, so this second plague with the frogs was a direct attack on Hecate specifically. And there's charts you can find online, go figure, where each plague is laid out against a particular Egyptian god. However, this is not a very useful way of viewing the plagues. As nice and biblical as it sounds, it's actually not helpful. And here I'm going to turn to Brian Godawa for an explanation of why. This is an excerpt from an article he wrote, and it's a little lengthy, but I think it's really eye-opening the way that he approaches this topic. He writes, an obvious connection might be that Yahweh is cursing or abusing the god of the particular creature in each plague. Many have tried to lay out charts of the plagues and which gods were affected. Common suggestions involve the god of the Nile for the first plague, the frog god Hecate for the second plague, Ra, the high sun god cursed by the ninth plague of darkness. But all these charts break down on a few points. First, the Egyptian pantheon had thousands of gods, so 10 plagues would be inconsequential to address such numbers with real impact. Second, while there can be direct correspondence of some plagues with some gods, like Hapi is the spirit of the Nile, Hecate is the frog god, Apis is the bull god for livestock, or even Ra, the sun god for darkness, the rest of the plagues do not have a similar application to specific deities. There is no ancient Egyptian god of flies. Apis is only a bull, but the plague struck all livestock, including sheep and other herd animals. There was no god of boils, hail, locusts, or firstborn. The gods suggested for those plagues are indirect, not direct representations of creatures. So, like some would say that Keper, the scarab beetle god, gets connected to flies or gnats. Nut, the sky goddess, gets connected to hail, presumably because hail comes from the sky. And then he goes on to give more examples like that. So Godawa is pointing out that these are very tenuous at best connections that people try to make to get this to fit their chart. He continues, the problem with this endeavor of connecting plagues to individual gods is that it creates far too many varying interpretations. Yahweh could be accused of not being very clear about his judgments in that case. Thirdly, even if one accepted this direct connection to specific gods, most of them are minor or inconsequential in the pantheon. Sure, Ra, the sun god addressed by the ninth plague, is a major deity, and Pharaoh as the firstborn son of Ra was as well, but the others, such as the frog goddess Hecate, are minor deities. The creator gods Amun, Ta, and Tot are nowhere directly attacked. The Ennead of Heliopolis are 9 major deities, of which Ra is only one. Most of the major deities get no honor of a plague devoted to them, yet they carried much of the mythology that drove Egypt's identity. Atum, the head of the Ennead, surely deserved to be cursed. Others included Isis and Osiris, whose love story defined the heart of Egypt, and Set, the god of chaos necessary to the struggle of order within the cosmos. These are just a few of the major deities of consequence who have no plague dedicated to them. If Yahweh were directing plagues at specific deities, he sure didn't target the right ones. A fourth problem comes from the fact that the pantheon evolved much over time, and not all the deities shared the same time periods, let alone that of Moses' era. Rather than a one-to-one correspondence, I see the plagues as an attack on the entire system, the pantheon of gods as a whole. The Egyptian cosmic picture was a sacralization of nature. When Yahweh broke down their environment and infected living things, he was reducing the gods to impotence, because nature to the ancient Egyptian was in essence an interacting pantheon of deities. It's not that there were specific deities of specific creatures or processes like a modern scientific itemized attribution. Rather, it was more like a narrative of multiple deities with many different manifestations and duties, all interacting to create, stabilize, and maintain the cosmos of creation. So Yahweh's plagues were breaking down that story, that system, and the elements and creatures tied to it. The plagues were not exhaustive of all nature and biology, but they were certainly representative of the system that Yahweh was deconstructing, or rather, decreating. And it goes on for a while longer, but I'll stop there for now, and I'll link to the rest in the show notes so you can do a little bit of a deeper dive if you'd like to on that. But I really appreciate his insights there, because I had never thought of it that way. I just assumed from everything I had heard growing up, oh yeah, each plague corresponded to a particular god, and I didn't see the logical inconsistencies, the holes in that paradigm. So, no, I don't think it's worth saying that every plague aligned with one particular god. I think it was more so just a takedown of the cosmic order that the Egyptians would have been looking for at that particular time, and what they would have expected the Pharaoh to be maintaining in his assumed role as the son of the divine gods. Now, as we move into verse 13, we start talking a lot about blood. And Alter points out that this theme of blood consistently runs through these first 12 chapters, and particularly around the central character of Moses. Moses' story as an adult starts with the bloodshed of the Egyptian taskmaster. And then on his way back to Egypt, Alter writes, is the blood of circumcision that saves his life, a strong foreshadowing of the 10th plague that evidently interprets circumcision as a kind of substitute for the sacrifice of the firstborn. Then the plagues begin with the turning of the water of the Nile into blood. End quote. And what we have here in verse 13 that is translated as plagues is actually a totally different word than what we have had before, and it means to strike. Verse 14 shows that this is about more than just blood and dinner plans. There's a lot of practicality to this, because verse 14 describes this as a remembrance ritual. It says, this will be to you for a memorial, and you will keep it a feast to Yahweh through your generations. That word for keep it there is an unusual word in Hebrew that actually refers to making a religious pilgrimage. So this isn't just remember to do this. Rather, it kind of literally means to make a journey for this. And the word that is translated feast, it's kag in Hebrew, it's less of a meal and more of a festival. And when it reads, by an ordinance, you shall do this by an ordinance, that means that this should become a yearly custom for them. Now, some people live very much by a routine. They like having a particular schedule and habits that they follow. I am much more of a spontaneous person where I find that I break out of rhythm a lot of times and I just go off and do something completely different. So for people like me, this verse reminds us of the importance of remembrance and ritual and how building little habits, little moments to stop, pause, take a breath, and think back on what has happened, even just what has happened in the day. You don't even have to go too far back in the past. It can be a very healthy practice. This is very psychologically healing, what God is telling them to do here, as he's saying, every year I want you to take out time and remember where you came from. Don't get distanced from your past. That doesn't mean you have to be shackled to your past. We can still move on from the past, but you don't want to totally break from it either, because when we do that, we no longer have the lessons of the past to learn from. The past is not meant to be worshipped and constantly maintained, but it is meant to be built upon and learned from. And that's what this remembrance ritual does. And do you notice how there is this feast built into it as well? This is not meant to be some solemn, all heads bowed, every eye closed sort of thing. This is a time of partying for Israel. And we're going to see this as we get into verse 16, when God calls this a holy convocation together. And convocation is just a fancy English word that means a calling together of people, usually for something to be read aloud. Remember that in the ancient world, most people couldn't read, so if you were going to read something, you needed to get everyone together and have probably one of the only people in your community that could read to everybody. And this is the first time that something is called a holy convocation, a holy meeting together in the Bible. And what is this holy convocation? It is a divine command to take a day off and feast. Stop and think about that for a second. Of all of the things that God could command his people to do, the very first one that is called a holy meeting together of people, the first time that Israel is now a nation separated from the slavery and the abuse that it had dealt with, the first act that God has as the divine leader of these people is to declare that they take a day off and feast. Here in the modern West, we live in a world that is obsessed with workaholism. We reward those who wear themselves out at their jobs. And this isn't just a secular thing. This happens just as much, if not more so, in churches as well. We expect pastors to do far more than the average person for far less pay. And we reward people who burn themselves out going for the kingdom of God, when what God really wants is for us to take care of these bodies and minds that he has given to us. Remember that built into the very foundation of time that he set up in the first 3 chapters of Genesis, literally just in the first chapter, he stops and says, okay, every week we're taking a pause. And we're just going to enjoy the beauty of creation. We're just going to enjoy time with family. We're going to enjoy good food, good friends, good fellowship. Think about Ecclesiastes if you listen to our study there. What is the meaning of life? to enjoy time with friends and family, to enjoy good food and drink, and to hopefully have a job that doesn't totally suck. And remember, too, that in the ancient world, eating meat was a special occurrence for most people throughout history. Today, we have distanced ourselves from the butchering of meat that shows up in our grocery stores every time we need it. We just go and we see it in nice shrink wrap packages. We are not bothered at all by any of what happens to the animals or how they are raised or how they are slaughtered. It doesn't even cross our minds when we pick up that discount pack at Walmart. But like we talked about last week, in the ancient world, meat was not that readily available. And for families that had animals, that kept them, and that raised livestock, they only slaughtered them for special occasions because you couldn't keep the meat fresh. You didn't have refrigeration. Preservation tactics were limited. So this festival could almost be seen as a wasteful occurrence in a way. It is taking far more than you would normally have on an average day. This was not, like, I don't know about you, but when I read this, it doesn't sound that different from an average day for me because I'm used to having my big protein with a small side of vegetables and maybe a little grain on the side. But for most ancient people, it would have been the other way around. It would have been mostly vegetables and grain and maybe a little bit of meat if you were lucky. So God's first official holy gathering in Scripture is a command to stop working and have a barbecue. And I absolutely love that. I think it would be wise for us to maybe incorporate that into some of our faith as well. If you, like I did, came from a low church background where we don't have much liturgy and official tradition, like we always have traditions, but not the kind that really has a bunch of ritual to it, it could be wise to incorporate some of this in. Even if it's just once a year things, just to take some time to pause and think about where you came from and celebrate a little extravagantly with friends and family. In verse 15, the Israelites are commanded to put away leaven from the houses. And put away is actually the same root as the word for Sabbath, Shvat. And there is a very harsh punishment here in verse 15 for those who do not put away leaven from their houses for this 7-day festival. Alter writes that the punishment will be invoked for a whole series of infractions as the Mosaic Law is promulgated. So in other words, the further on you go in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the more you will find this phrasing of so-and-so will be cut off from Israel if they do X thing. He writes that perhaps the most likely reference is to some form of ostracism, though both medieval and modern commentators have speculated about whether premature death or childlessness might be suggested by the phrase. End quote. So what that means is there's a few different theories of what exactly it means to be cut off from Israel. I think the way that I would have read this at a younger age would be like punishment by death. Like this person is to be put to death, to be cut off from the land of the living. But that doesn't seem to be what's going on here. Now, there are some who think that there could be a spiritual element added in where God gets involved and actually prevents that person from being able to have children, because then their line would be cut off from Israel, their heritage, which would have been very important in that time and culture. But what it most likely is talking about is just a simple ostracization, where the people of Israel who were following this command would shun the person who did not. So it's not saying that they would be killed or even not allowed to live in Israel, but just that they would be treated as a pariah. And that comes across a little harsh for my tastes. As a therapist, I've seen a lot of negative effects of using shame against people to get your way. It can be a very effective tool, but it can also be very psychologically damaging. I know you could look at this and say it's a very basic identity marker that doesn't really ask much of you. Like, all you have to do is not cook leavened bread for 1 week. So it's a relatively low bar that just establishes whether or not you want to be a member of the community. Like, if you don't do this, you are setting yourself up for not being a rule follower in the community. Like, it's not asking a very high bar of what you would need to do to fit in. I get that. It's still just, again, this is me personally. I look at it and I go, this seems really harsh for just a restriction about what you are going to eat. So this is just another example of how we have to remember how different the culture of the Bible was. It was very much based in this honor-shame mentality, where this would have been a very effective, albeit possibly damaging way to maintain community boundaries. Verse 17 has a reference to Passover now as the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And last week I gave a little bit of comment on how many scholars believe those were two separate events in early Israelite history. Because we have to remember that these texts that we have here in the Bible were not written exactly as the events happened. They were written later on. Oral tradition may have come earlier, but they were written down later and then edited again later around the time of the Babylonian captivity. So it seems like maybe one early group of Israelites had this tradition of Passover. Another early group had a tradition of a Feast of Unleavened Bread, and possibly even a third group had a tradition of a dedication of a firstborn. And over time, these 2 or 3 festivals got lumped together into one. So Passover and Feast of Unleavened Bread are the same thing when you read them in the Bible, even though they may have had different connotations in the earlier days. Oddly enough, the word translated self-same in verse 17 in the King James, for in this self-same day I've brought your armies out of the land of Egypt, it's literally the word for bones. And going out a little more into metaphor, it can be used to describe the substance of a thing. So in this very roundabout, ethereal way, it came to mean same as well as bones. So a very literal translation here would be, for in the bones day I have brought your armies out of the land of Egypt. But since that doesn't make sense, we know from context, okay, this is going to be talking about the same day that this happened. And note how Israel is described in terms of an army here. I have brought your armies out of the land of Egypt. It's been a couple weeks now, but I remember bringing up this note before. Israel is not an army. They are a bunch of escaped slaves, and yet they are spoken of in military language here. And armies is the same root as Sabaoth that we hear in the title Lord of Hosts or Yahweh Sabaoth that you might know, that sometimes shows up in Christian terminology when they're using names of God. So the same root word describing an army. As Moses speaks with the elders in verse 21, recall that elders does not have to mean the oldest people there, but more so just the leaders of the tribes, which often would be older people, but it can have both meanings. And he tells them to both draw out and take you a lamb according to your families. Literally, it would be to drag and grasp. So that feels a little redundant there, which usually means that the author of the text is trying to emphasize what he is saying. You are going to make sure that you have this one particular lamb for your household. And verse 22, when it says that you will strike the 2 sides and the lintel above, that word strike is the same word used from what Zipporah struck Moses with the bloody foreskin of his son in Exodus 4:25. So the author likely chose that word back in chapter 4 as a foreshadowing of this event. You may remember in previous episodes we talked about how much of Moses' life is set up to foreshadow what happens when Israel leaves Egypt. So they kind of bookend, they kind of form a little bit of a chiasm in some ways as these events line up between Moses' life and now Israel's story. I think I commented on this last week, but we do not know exactly what this hyssop plant would have been, but it was likely some kind of herbaceous plant. In verse 23, again, this is not the word for Passover that is related to the word Passover, Pesach. This is a different verb again, and different from the one in verse 12 as well. But there's something else I want to focus on here in verse 23. So let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we will discuss who actually kills the firstborn in the 10th plague. Okay, here is where we are going to jump back to when I asked you to remember something from earlier. Back in chapter 11, God said that he was going to personally walk through Egypt, inspect it, and then the firstborn would be killed. But it never said that God would be the one to kill them. In fact, there was no establishment of who the executioner would be. Chapter 12, in verse 12, had Yahweh saying that he would kill the firstborn as he goes through Egypt. But here in verse 23, we see a very different picture. Let me read it again. For Yahweh will pass through to smite the Egyptians. So that seems like it's in line here where God is the one who is going to kill the firstborn. But when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the 2 side posts, Yahweh will pass over the door. All right, so far so good, makes sense, we're all consistent. And will not suffer the destroyer to come in unto your houses to smite you. Cue record scratch, what the heck just happened? We have this idea of God being the one who would kill the firstborn, and yet here we have a completely different entity thrown into the mix. And this entity's name is the Destroyer. How strange is that? The destroyer will not come into your house to smite you. Well, here's what Alter has to say about it. The language here is mysterious and seems to suggest that there is some kind of death force that is what actually strikes the firstborns during the 10th plague. And Yahweh's relationship to the death force is whether he will stand in its way or not to protect the house in question. Notably, the word for destroyer used here in Exodus 12 is the same word used to describe the floodwaters in Genesis 6 through 9, mashkit. There are numerous words repeated throughout Exodus 1 that link the story to the flood narrative and picture Passover as a flood itself, the cosmic handing over of Egypt to the death forces they themselves had been perpetuating in the world. Because all firstborns were destined for death in the 10th plague, the blood of the Passover lamb symbolically stood in for the firstborn of each house, with Yahweh himself not as their destroyer, but as their protector. Redemption in this case means people destined for and enslaved to death were purchased and set free into the realm of life. From this point forward, every generation owes the lives of the firstborn to this first generation. Passover is a meal in which the story continues to be retold, but the redemption of every firstborn of every family throughout Israel's history is another way of continually acknowledging that Israel owes their lives to the sparing of the firstborn at Passover. Eventually, the Levites take on the firstborn role within all of Israel as people who represent Israel and God to each other, while entirely relying on God's generosity for their provision. So the firstborn is not redeemed, get this, the firstborn is not redeemed from God, but from death. There is great complexity here because the reason Israel is enslaved to death in Egypt is because God has handed Israel over to the death forces, like he handed all of creation over to the flood. Just like in the flood, Yahweh simultaneously provides an ark of sorts, a way of being rescued from death. It's no coincidence that Jesus timed his crucifixion to coincide with Passover. The New Testament writers talk about atonement this way. Not that the followers of Jesus are redeemed or rescued from God, but actually that God rescues us from death. End quote. And I believe at the start I attributed that to Robert Alter. That's actually from Bible Project, a conversation that John Collins and Tim Mackey had together. I really appreciate what they're getting at here because it shows the nuance of this passage. In our nice, clean-cut, modern Western systematic theology mindset, we like an easy answer of, okay, who is the one responsible for this? Well, we're going to say God was punishing the Egyptians and he is the one who killed them. However, that is not the entirety of the biblical story. You can look at verse 12 in this chapter and come to that conclusion. Or you could look at verse 23 in this chapter and come to the conclusion that it was actually a different entity known as the Mashkit, the destroyer. Which is correct? Well, that's kind of up to you to decide and debate, because the Bible presents both of these as an option. So certain people are going to lean a little bit more on one side or the other, but I find this idea of the destroyer liberating in a way, if I can put it that way, because it doesn't have God going through and killing a bunch of innocent people. It has him actually stopping this being from doing that in certain cases. Now, that doesn't necessarily take him off the hook, because you could then still ask, well, if he can stop that being in certain cases, why not stop him in all cases where there were innocents, whether or not they used the blood? And we talked a little bit more about that last week, and how in the ancient mindset, the whole land could become corrupted to the point that they thought it needed this control, alternate, delete, reset of the whole thing. It's worth remembering, too, that at this point in Jewish theology, there is not really an antagonist for God. The devil, as we think of him in Christian culture, has not developed to be the being that we consider him to be. This is something we've talked about a little bit on and off in the podcast. Hopefully we'll get to do an actual episode about it before too long. But it's not this capital S Satan, like a proper name, like we think of him in Christian culture. Within the Hebrew Bible, there is no Satan, the Satan, or more accurately, Ha-Satan in Hebrew. It is not one particular being whose name is Satan. It is some sort of a neutral, rather than evil, supernatural being whose job was to be the prosecutor against humanity. He is the prosecuting attorney who says, such and such person has done X thing according to the way you have told them to live, Yahweh. they should be judged. This is what we see happen in the book of Job. That is not Satan as Christians have taken him to be, but rather the Satan, Hasatan, the prosecuting attorney. He is not evil, he is just doing his job. And it is later traditions that built on that and created the devil figure that we think of today. Whole other conversation for another day, but I bring that up because I believe it could help to explain what's going on here and why we have some verses saying that God is responsible for the death of the firstborn and other verses saying that it is the destroyer. Because at this point in Jewish theology, there was no antagonist for God. God was this supreme being who was responsible both for good and for evil that happened in the world. And so, since he is the creator of all, he is responsible for all. That means he is the creator of this destroyer, and that means that he is also responsible for this destroyer creature. And so, in some way, whatever this destroyer does comes from God. And yet God can also act in opposition to him because they are separate beings. And in fact, some scholars even believe that this destroyer could be the angel of the Lord that we find in other passages of the Tanakh, the Old Testament. The angel of the Lord, or the angel of Yahweh, is depicted in several passages, Numbers 22:23, Numbers 22:31, Joshua 5:13, 1 Chronicles 21:16, as having a drawn sword in his hand. There is an obvious connection in this verse and the rest of the chapter between the destroyer and Yahweh who brings that destruction. And we can feel uncomfortable with that connection. But we have to remember that this was judgment on the gods of Egypt, and that is likely why such a high-profile spiritual being as this Mashkit, this destroyer, was enlisted to enact such violence. So most scholars believe that this destroyer creature is the one meant to be seen as the executioner in this passage. He is separate from Yahweh. He is possibly the angel of the Lord figure that we see throughout the Tanakh. He is some sort of evil angel, if you will. And I don't necessarily mean that as in he is on the side of bad, but that what he does is to bring violence into the world. And God actually acts here, in one sense, allowing him to do this for those who do not follow the instructions of putting the blood on the door, but also standing in opposition against him, like he is some sort of unstoppable force that just wants to kill, 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 and Yahweh actually steps in the way and says, not here, move on. So this is a really important picture where where the Israelites are not being saved from God, but are being saved by God. And I don't think it's too far of a stretch to start imagining how that realization could impact our ideas about salvation and the crucifixion of Jesus as well. Because the way the New Testament authors present salvation and the implications of the death of Jesus can often make it sound like God is saving us from himself. Like he is the one who says, I'm going to kill you, but I'm also going to not kill you if you do things this way. I think reading the passage of the death of the firstborn in light of this also colors the way we see the crucifixion, especially since Jesus died on Passover. It's not about being saved from God, it is actually being saved by God from an external personification of death. I know it's a very different way of viewing it than we're used to, but it's right here in the text. But I think it makes a lot more sense than the ways that we are used to reading these passages. And while we're on this topic, I want to go back to a conversation we had, I believe it was in the very first episode of the series, going back several months now, to the stuff you don't know you don't know. This is not the only story about firstborn children dying in Egypt. Now, this is from the Israelite perspective, but we actually have stories from Egypt's own mythologies where there is mention, very enigmatic mention, but mention nonetheless, of firstborn being killed. This is drawing heavily on the work of Gary Rensburg in his article Moses the Magician here. For starters, there is a fragment from the pyramid texts that reads, "It is the king who will be judged with him whose name is hidden," kind of sounds like Voldemort there, "on this day of the slaying of the firstborn." There's also the coffin texts, which have a fragment that reads, "I am he who will be judged with him whose name is hidden on this night of the slaying of the firstborn." Another part of it reads, "This night of the slaying of the firstborn, this day of the slaying of the firstborn." And unfortunately, that's about all we have. The texts don't go on with more explanation of what happened. It's just fragments and passing mentions. But what is absolutely wild about this is not the Egyptian version of what we read here in the Bible. because all three of those quotes that I just read you came from long before the Exodus would have happened. The pyramid texts are from about 2320 BCE. When was the Exodus supposed to happen? Well, at the earliest possible time, 1446. This is almost 1,000 years before the conservative date for the Exodus happening. The coffin texts are from around 2000 BCE, so around 600 years before the conservative date for the Exodus happening. So whatever is going on here in this story is not the first time that Egypt had a mythology about the firstborn being killed. And unfortunately, we don't really have more information about it than what I've just shared here. But it goes to show that this is not just some unique occurrence. It seems like whatever God was doing, whatever the biblical authors were writing about here in this 10th plague, it was drawing on something that had happened hundreds upon hundreds of years earlier in Egyptian history. It's really weird, but it's also really fascinating, and it goes to show how the Bible was not written in a vacuum. It drew on the cultures and the legends of its day. In verse 25, we read that God says, the children of Israel will keep this service once they come into the land. So it is a flash forward into a time ahead of this when Israel will actually be in the land of Canaan. And that word for service at the end of the verse comes from the same root as the word for slaves or servants. So this is actually forced labor that is being talked about here, reminding us that, once again, this is not necessarily, in the ancient mindset, God's freeing the slaves as much as it is his buying them to be his slaves instead, because he will be a much more benevolent master than Pharaoh is. Very different than how we'd like to look at it, but that's just the mindset of the time. In verse 27, you may notice a slight variation depending on the version you use, as some translations will say that the people bowed, others say bowed their heads, and others say knelt. The words used here for the people bowing their heads and worshiping are essentially synonyms. They both mean to bow down or to kneel as a sign of seeing someone else as being of higher status than you. And there's a little bit of a time-bending aspect going on here in verse 28, because this section ends saying that the children of Israel went away and did as Yahweh had commanded Moses and Aaron. But there's actually no record of Moses ever telling the people all these things that God told him to tell them in the previous verses. We have verse 3, where God tells Moses to say all this to the people, and then verses 27 to 28 are just a record of the people's responses. So we don't actually have Moses going and telling the people that, which I think is probably just to save time and space, because it would be very repetitive to have those same verses said again in Moses' mouth. So it almost kind of reads to me like an Ocean's 11 heist scene. You know what I mean? Where you have the voiceover explaining what's going to happen while you're watching the clips of the actual thing happening. So I think that's kind of what's going on here in this verse. Let's take a quick pause here before we get any further, and we'll pick it up in verse 30. Let's read the next 9 verses of the chapter here. And Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and all his servants, and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where there was not one dead. And he called for Moses and Aaron by night, and said, Rise up, get you from among my people, both you and the children of Israel, and go, serve Yahweh as you said, and take your flocks and your herds as you've said, and be gone, and bless me also. And the Egyptians were urgent upon the people that they might send them out of the land in haste, for they said, We be all dead men. And the people took their dough before it was leavened, their kneading troughs being bound up in their clothes upon their shoulders. And the children of Israel did according to the word of Moses. They borrowed of the Egyptians jewels of silver and jewels of gold and raiment. And Yahweh gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they lent to them such things as they required, and they spoiled the Egyptians. And the children of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Succoth, about 600,000 on foot that were men, besides children. And a mixed multitude went up also from them, and flocks and herds, even very much cattle. And they baked unleavened cakes of the dough which they brought forth of Egypt, for it was not leavened, because they were thrust out of Egypt and could not tarry, neither had they prepared for themselves any victual. Verse 30 makes it very clear that this final plague happens at night. The decreation of Egypt ends at night, just as creation in Genesis 1 began at night. Recall how the days in Genesis 1 are the evening and the morning were the first day. So creation starts at night, decreation ends at night. Verse 32 is rather strange, and it has led to quite a bit of debate, because this is Pharaoh's final words to Moses. He tells them that they can go, that they can take their children and their flocks and their herds and all of their possessions, and he ends by asking, "Bless me also." What do you think that could mean? What would it mean for the ruler of Egypt, the God incarnate of Egypt, who has been stubborn against Yahweh for 10 signs now? What would it mean for him to ask Yahweh to bless him through Moses? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. So if you want to stop the episode and drop a comment in our socials or on the YouTube comment section or what have you, in the Discord, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what does it mean for Pharaoh to ask for God to bless him. This is actually the first use of the word bless in Exodus. It is a word that was central to God's plan to reunite humanity through Abraham's family in the Genesis scroll. So naturally, scholars have suggested several different possible meanings for Pharaoh's interjection here. Some have suggested it is a conversion moment where he is finally seeing Yahweh as the one true God, but I see no indication of that. Particularly, and again, we are going to be stopping our study here in chapter 12, but if you're familiar at all with the story, you know that he very shortly thereafter goes back on all this and chases after the people, trying to bring them back into Egypt. So I see no indication that this is a conversion moment for him. There is a Jewish tradition that the Pharaoh was himself a firstborn and was asking to be spared from the same fate that his child faced. But I don't see why he would have survived longer than any other firstborns at this point. Like, if his firstborn already died, and he himself was a firstborn, why would he not have also died around the same time? If the destroying angel was already there in the palace, why would he have not taken out Pharaoh at the same time as well? So it's a fascinating idea, but I don't think that one has much clout behind it either. Some scholars think he is asking for the sign itself to stop. But again, it has already happened. The destroyer has already gone through apparently a significant portion of Egypt, enough that he's gone to the palace. So it seems unlikely to me, unless maybe he's asking for no more signs to occur. And we know now that there were only 10 plagues, but for all he knew, there could have been 10 more after this. So I guess that's possible. But in my mind, that's not a blessing as much as it is a cessation of punishment. So if that's really what he was asking, I think he would have said, "Please make these signs stop," instead of, "Please bless me also." There are others who suggest he was asking for Moses to offer a sacrifice for him when the people were out of the land and sacrificed to Yahweh their God. Now, I think that is definitely a possibility, but I still don't necessarily see that as the best option. So let me give you one more thought on this, and then I will get into what I believe the correct interpretation for this is. And this thought comes from Victor Hamilton, who sees an echo of Jacob's refusal to let the angel go before the angel blessed him. You remember that story? About 2/3 of the way through Genesis, we have Jacob, who is about to be named Israel, the ancestor of the tribes that we have here in this story, as he wrestles with this supernatural being by a river before he meets his brother Esau for the first time in years. And he is fighting with this supernatural creature and refuses to let that creature go before daybreak until he blesses him. So there seems to be perhaps an echo of that story here, a reversal of it, if you will, where instead of Israel, Jacob, refusing to allow the representative of God to go before a blessing, now we have Pharaoh, who is supposed to be a representative of the gods himself, a son of the gods, asking for the descendant of Israel, of Jacob, Moses, to bless him before he leaves. It's fascinating. But I don't think that gets to the main heart of why Pharaoh would ask to be blessed. So let's get to why I believe he says that here. And this idea comes from Walter Brueggemann. He writes, "The great king of Egypt, who presides over a monopoly of the region's resources, asks Moses and Aaron to bless him. The powers of scarcity admit to this little community of abundance. It is clear that you are the wave of the future. So before you leave, lay your powerful hands upon us and give us energy. The text shows that the power of the future is not in the hands of those who believe in scarcity and monopolize the world's resources. It is in the hand of those who trust God's abundance. End quote. This is a theme that Bible Project has drawn heavily on in recent years. It is a theme that is woven throughout the entirety of the biblical narrative. In a world where resources were scarce, where the richest people of those days were still poorer than many of us today, it was natural to grasp and to seize and to try to assume that there were limited resources and that you had to get enough for you and your tribe, forget about everyone else and their tribe. And yet the idea throughout the biblical narrative is that that is not the way to live. That scarcity mindset, that there is not enough to go around, that there are finite resources, that there are only so many pieces of the pie for us to clamor over. That's not how God intended it. God created Eden as a place of abundance where there would be more than enough. And our role as humanity was to spread that out to other people and to other places. And we see this as early as the story of Cain and Abel, where God does not say, I am only going to pick one of you to bless, and it just so happened to be Abel. But rather, God says, there is enough for us to go around. He tells Cain, don't you know that you will be rewarded if you do well? There is still enough blessing for you as well. It's not just, oh, we pick the firstborn to bless and he's going to get more than the rest of you. No, in God's economy, there is more than enough for everyone. But Cain had this scarcity mindset that said there would be limited resources, limited love, limited blessing, and so he had to take from Abel to have enough for himself, and look at where that got him. And so the more you start paying attention to this theme, the more you start noticing that it is the people who hoard wealth, who hoard resources, who chase after blessing, that actually end up being the antagonists of most biblical stories. They are not painted in a rosy light, and rather is the people who live as if there is enough to go around, who live sharing their resources, sharing their wealth, sharing their food, sharing their possessions with other people. Those are the ones who are blessed even more so, and who are seen as a blessing to others. And so we have in Egypt this system of oppression that is built on a scarcity mindset that says there is not enough to go around. And it goes all the way back to the time of Joseph, when he and the Pharaoh of that day decided that there would not be enough resources to feed the people of Egypt during the time of famine. So they stockpile resources and they tax people on their resources, and then they sell it back to them at a higher price. And that mindset, while it may have saved Egypt during the time of famine, as it continued to be used after the famine, it became a tool of oppression against the people. And the problem is that Pharaoh now sees everything is being taken away from me. As I took from everyone else, now it is being taken from me. And I see that y'all are the ones who have more than enough. I want to have more than enough again. Include me in this blessing, this Eden-like existence that you have. And we don't know how Moses responds. There is no recorded response of Moses. There is nothing where he says, okay, sure, I'll bless you. There's nothing where he says, are you kidding me? Absolutely not. He just walks away. And we never know how he responds to that request. I would be remiss if I went any further into this passage without turning the question on us. Will you act more like Pharaoh, like Egypt, hoarding resources, hoarding money, hoarding possessions, acting as if there is not enough to go around? Or will you be more like the economy that God was trying to set up, where those with a little bit more see those with a little bit less and say, how can I help? We have far more than enough in America today. And I realize in this divided world in which we live, it seems to be getting more and more polarized every day. It seems more and more that we need to hoard and just focus on me and my tribe and not give a crap about what happens to you and yours. You take care of yourself, I'll take care of myself. And I mean, just think about during COVID. What happened when we immediately rushed to grab all of the toilet paper, all of the hand sanitizer, or when you have a storm come by and you get all of the bread, all of the eggs, all of the milk? We hoard. We are so quick to give in to our baser instincts and to assume that even though we have enough right now, there could come a time when we don't have enough. And yet I am reminded of Jesus' words in the sermon where he said that the birds of the air don't worry about having enough food for tomorrow. The plants of the field don't worry about having enough energy to produce tomorrow. The sun has always risen again. Humanity has continued through horrible tragedies. We are still here. There is more than enough to go around. And if we proceed about life in a scarcity mindset that assumes I have to put me and mine first over you and yours, even if it hurts you and yours, we are missing out on the plan that God had for us. There shouldn't be no such thing as a Christian doomsday prepper. There should be no such thing as a Christian hoarder. They are antithetical. They are oxymoronic, dare I even say. There should be no such thing as a Christian who loads up their shopping cart with multiples of the same thing that they do not need for the family size that they have. That is not the way of Jesus. That is not the way of God. That is not the way of the Bible. The message of Scripture is that God will provide, regardless of how bleak or scary things may seem, and that the more you strive to do this in your own strength, the less God is going to step in to take care of you, and the more you are going to be hurting the people around you. May we all choose to be more like Moses and Israel in this case than like Pharaoh in Egypt. May we all see the abundance of God's goodness in the world around us and choose to share and partake in it with those around us rather than seeing them as competitors. We can see them as friends, co-creators, co-creations, co-rulers of God's creation. That is the Eden vision God has for us. In verse 33, the Egyptians are said to be urgent upon the people, and the literal meaning of that verb is actually was strong. This same verb, atzak, is used for the strengthening of Pharaoh's heart. And so Robert Alter sees a connection here, as we have read over and over again in the previous chapters, that Pharaoh's heart was strengthened, and now is the Egyptians who are strengthened against the people of Israel, because they assume that they will all be killed next. Again, we know in hindsight there's only 10 plagues, 10 signs, but they didn't know that. So they thought that there would be an 11th, and it's that they would all be killed. And so as the people leave Egypt, they pass through these bloody doorposts, and they don't look back. They move on into a new life, much like childbirth. When you have a baby being born, passing through, if you will, a bloody doorpost, and not looking back, but beginning life anew. That is the symbolism of what the Israelites are doing now, as they move into their new lives as freed slaves of Yahweh instead of Pharaoh. Verse 34 mentions that they leave with their kneading troughs bound up in their clothes on their shoulders. A kneading trough there is a shallow bowl that would be made to roll out bread. And the clothes that are mentioned upon their shoulders were not mentioned in previous verses. So it's fascinating that it is actually the same word translated raiment in verse 35 that they take from the Egyptians. So it seems like these clothes that they wrap up their bowls and belongings in may have actually been stolen from the Egyptians themselves. Alter leans into this thought as well, noting that it is probably assumed that the slaves of Egypt would not have had anything more than simple work tunics, and not the cloaks that they would need for a journey. In Egyptian paintings, slaves are often depicted wearing only a short skirt and naked from the waist up. End quote. So it is quite likely that these clothes that they are now wearing are Egyptian. In verse 36, the King James reads that the Egyptians lent unto them such things as they required. And you'll notice that most of that is in italics, meaning that it is an interpolation to make better sense of Hebrew that doesn't translate over well into English. As we talked about in previous weeks, this is not as they required. This is whatever they demanded. The Israelites were straight up looting, while the families were in too much shock to do anything about it. We talked more about the problematic elements of that last week, so I'd encourage you to go back and check out that episode if you haven't already. Verse 37 gives us some fascinating topics of discussion that you might not guess just from looking at the verse. First off, the word translated journey, the children of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Succoth. It's literally a word meaning to tear out or uproot. So this is not just their taking a little weekend vacation, like was initially suggested by Moses to Pharaoh. This is their uprooting their entire lives and going somewhere else. This is their burning the ships and saying, we are not going back. And the word for children here at the very end of the verse doesn't get used much in the Tanakh, but it does show up a decent amount of times at the end of Genesis as Jacob's family moved down to Egypt. So I think there may be a little bit of a hyperlink there. Betak and Rensburg give some insights into this verse that I had never heard anywhere else, so I want to share this quote with you from them. And this is about the route that the Israelites take as they leave Egypt, because the verse reads that they go from Ramses to Sukkot, about 600,000 on foot that were men besides children. Here's what they say. Regardless of the manner in which the Torah presents Israel's history, it is noteworthy that the account includes an Egyptian force sent to pursue escaped slaves. This is going to be in chapter 14 when Pharaoh sends out soldiers to go bring them back before they get to the crossing of the Reed Sea. Then Betek and Rensburg continue, saying, it was perfectly natural, in fact, even when only 2 slaves had escaped. And they're talking about sending soldiers after them. Moreover, the route of the 2 escaped slaves is significant, and here they're referencing a document that they talked about earlier in the chapter of this book. The 2 sites mentioned in this document that was found from ancient Egypt are Jeku and Migdol. The former is equivalent to the Hebrew term Sukkot, that is, Sukkoth, in English Bible translations. And did you catch that was the location that they go to here in verse 37? They travel from Ramses to Sukkot. All right, so this Sukkot is called Jeku, Tjeku, in this ancient Egyptian document, and is the very site mentioned here as the Israelites' point of departure. Migdol, from that Egyptian document, is also mentioned in the biblical account in Exodus 14, even if we cannot locate the site precisely. Note further that the term is simply a variant pronunciation of the common Hebrew noun Migdal, which means tower. Most likely, Migdol refers to one of the fortresses or towers in the chain of such sites constructed by the Egyptian administration to supervise the eastern approaches to Egypt, memory of which was kept alive by the Israelites as a component of the Exodus tradition. Of all the place names in the general area of the eastern delta, it is rather striking that both the book of Exodus and this Egyptian document, P. Anastase 5, should mention both Sukkot and Migdol in connection with escaping slaves. Now here's the point that they're trying to get across. The evidence strongly suggests that the Israelites were using a route well traveled by fugitive slaves, somewhat akin to the Underground Railroad of American history. End quote. That is a fascinating theory, that there was actually an established secret route that escaped slaves would take to leave Egypt, and it seems like the Israelites may be following that path themselves. Before we move on from this verse, we have to talk about how many people left Egypt, because pretty much every English translation is going to say something along the lines of 600,000 men besides children. It's a little strange that women are left out of this count entirely. Now, we know it was a patriarchal culture, so they're going to be focusing on the men, but they do mention children as an aside. And this is not just men in general. This is not the normal word for men. It's actually the word giborim, which literally means strong men. And it's kind of a callback to Genesis 6, where they talk about the mighty men of renown. So these are often depicted as soldiers. As we've talked about several times now, Israel did not have soldiers. They were not an army. But this would likely be referring to the most able-bodied men, the men that would end up fighting as they go into the land. So if they were of fighting age, that likely means that they were probably married as well. And since polygamy was not as frowned upon back then as it was today, many of them probably had more than one wife. So you can add at least another 600,000, if not possibly 1.2 million to that number. And then you have to consider, well, how many kids would they have had back then? 5 to 10 would be a relatively small number compared to some families at that time, particularly when multiple wives would be considered. So a lot of conservative scholars generally estimate around 2 to 5 million people left Egypt at this point. Now, that being said, there is ongoing scholarly debate about these numbers, because the word translated thousands in Hebrew does not necessarily have to mean thousands. It most literally means clans which can be smaller than thousands, or even contingents, which some scholars believe could be as small as 10 people each. And it was only through later interpolation that this word came to mean thousands, because it just meant multitudes or groups of people together. So, just judging based on what we know of Egypt at this time, it seems very unlikely that there would have been 2 to 5 million Israelites in the land as slaves, and that all of them would have traveled from Egypt into Canaan with 40 years in between and have left little to no trace of their existence archaeologically. So many scholars today do believe that thousand is not the best translation here. Now, not all are going to go with as small of a number as 10 instead of 1,000, in which case it would be about 6,000 men. That's the difference. Rather than 600,000, that would be about 6,000. But many scholars will have it in maybe the tens of thousands of people that left. That could be a more reasonable number. Ultimately, we do not know the exact number, and good Christians can disagree on this. This is not a bunch of liberals trying to deny the Bible if you see someone say, well, it probably wasn't millions of people. That's just our best understanding of the scholarship that we have available to us today, taken in accord with a Hebrew word that can be flexible in translation. Either way, whether we're talking about millions, thousands, tens of thousands, it is a massive population movement. And verse 38 tells us that not only were these Israelites that left, but, quote, a mixed multitude. Now, I would love for you to pause the episode right now and drop a comment wherever you're listening to this on what you believe the mixed multitude is, because I absolutely had an idea of what that was based on how I was taught this story in church. And I did not realize until I was doing the study for this episode that there's actually debate about what this meant. So if you have an idea of what the mixed multitude is that leaves with Israel, go ahead, stop the episode, and let us know what you think that is. Because I'm going to go on now and try to give us a better understanding of it moving forward. For starters, I'll share with you how I was always taught to read the passage. And this was a very positive thing. It was presented to me as people who decided that Yahweh was the one true God, and that they were essentially going to become Israelites. So we viewed the mixed multitude pretty much as converts. They were not ethnically Jewish, but by belief they were now Jewish. However, that's not the only interpretation that is out there. In fact, the etymology of the words used, Erev Rav, that's what mixed multitude is, Erev Rav, it kind of has a negative connotation to it. And Umberto Cassuto, a very prominent scholar, has suggested that the English word riffraff actually comes closest to getting across the idea and also the cadence of the Hebrew word. There are various traditions across Jewish interpretation as well, that this Erev Rav, this mixed multitude, this riffraff, were actually mercenary forces who would go on to help the Israelites in battle. Some believed that they were essentially converts to Judaism, much like I had been taught. Others thought that they were just people in Egypt who saw an opportunity to get out of a really bad situation, perhaps like other slaves or prisoners of war. Some scholars have believed that these were foreigners, not necessarily Egyptians, but just non-Israelites, who had intermarried with the Israelites while they were in Egypt. There's even a Jewish tradition that the mixed multitude was actually made up of the magicians from Pharaoh's court. Regardless of who exactly you believe this group was, I think there's two sides of the coin we have to look at with them. One is the negative side. It does seem that they play a negative role in the story, particularly later on. In Numbers chapter 11, they are directly blamed as the instigators for the Israelites complaining in a particular instance regarding the manna. However, even if their character wasn't exactly in line with what God wanted, I can't help but see their inclusion with the Israelites as a positive thing. Because from the very beginning, it was not about God's separating out a holy people to himself so that everyone would become Jews. Rather, it was about his taking this small group of people aside and using them as a prism through which his plan to redeem and restore all of humanity to an Eden-like existence with him could then broaden out into a whole spectrum of light-filled love for the world. So whoever they may have been, I believe it is relatively clear they were not of Jewish descent. And so, at very least, there is a positive aspect that Israel is now seen in their very first act as a nation, as they leave Egypt and become their own people, that they are already bringing non-Israelites into the covenant family. A people who were not God's people are becoming God's people, fulfilling the promise to Abraham of bringing the other nations back into Eden-like fellowship with God. Time to finish out the chapter. Let's pick it up in verse 40. Now the sojourning of the children of Israel who dwelt in Egypt was 430 years. And it came to pass at the end of the 430 years, even the selfsame day it came to pass, that all the hosts of Yahweh went out from the land of Egypt. It is a night to be much observed unto Yahweh for bringing them out of the land of Egypt. This is the night of Yahweh to be observed of all the children of Israel in their generations. And Yahweh said to Moses and Aaron, This is the ordinance of the Passover. There shall no stranger eat thereof. But every man's servant that is bought for money, when you have circumcised him, then he will eat from it. A foreigner and an hired servant will not eat from it. In one house will it be eaten. You will not carry forth any of the flesh abroad from the house, neither will you break a bone of it. All the congregation of Israel will keep it. And when a stranger will sojourn with you, and will keep the Passover to Yahweh, let all his males be circumcised, and then let them come near and keep it. And he will be as one that is born in the land, for no uncircumcised person will eat of it. One law will be to him who is homeborn, and to the stranger that sojourns among you. Thus did all the children of Israel, as Yahweh had commanded Moses and Aaron, so did they. And it came to pass the selfsame day that Yahweh did bring the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt by their armies. So verse 39 has the Israelites leaving with their unleavened bread baked in what the King James calls cakes. Really, it's round, flat loaves of bread. And it says that they didn't have any time to prepare victual. That is a word that means food for a journey. And in fact, this word only shows up 10 times, one of which is when Isaac asks Esau for what the King James calls venison. It's the same word here translated victual, so food for a journey. 2 more occurrences are in the story of Joseph deceiving his brothers on their way back home to their father. So there seems to be a little bit of a hyperlinking back and forth by using this uncommon word. More ink than you could possibly believe has been spilled on verse 40. And that's because it says that at the end of 430 years, all the hosts of Yahweh went out from the land of Egypt. This number of 430 is a problem for several reasons. Firstly, in Genesis 15:13, when God predicts to Abram, later Abraham, that his descendants would be slaves in a land that was not their own, he says that they would be there for 400 years. So Genesis 15:13 says 400 years. Our verse here, Exodus 12:40, says 430 years. And the Jewish commentator Rashi, when he's writing on this passage, notes that if you add up the genealogies, we get a much shorter number of years, because Moses' grandfather, Kehat, is listed as one of the people who leaves Canaan with Jacob when they first go into Egypt. And he is said to live 133 years. His son, Moses' father, Amram, lives 137, and Moses lives 80 to this point. So that does not even total the 400 years, much less the 430 of this passage. Now, it is true that many times big round numbers like this in the Bible are exactly that, round numbers. So when God says 400 years in Genesis, 430 is probably close enough that we don't need to be splitting hairs over this. It's only a problem if you're trying to be ultra-literalistic about the Bible. That is the only real way this becomes a major contradiction. Now, there are some scholars who have noted that it seems that Abraham's family spent about 215 years in the land of Canaan before they went to Egypt. So it's possible that the 430 was seen as a doubling of the 215 years that they were in the land of Canaan. And Tim Mackey of Bible Project has connected this to Isaiah 40, verse 2, where God said that Israel received double for her sins. So there's possibly a little bit of connection there between the time that Israel spent in Canaan and the time that they spend in Egypt. And in fact, there is Jewish tradition that explains the discrepancy in years by saying that the countdown of 400 years actually goes all the way back to the time of Isaac's birth. and that it includes some of the time that they were in Canaan, because God didn't say that they would be in Egypt for 400 years, but rather that they would be in, quote, a land that is not theirs. And since Abraham didn't technically own any of the land of Canaan that he was a nomad in, that could be seen as part of the time that they were living in a land not their own. And so then when you add up the time of Isaac's life and Jacob's life, it accounts for about 190 of the 400 total years that Israel was in a land not their own. So then they would have actually only been in Egypt for about 210 years rather than the 400 or 430 that we tend to think of. As we get into verse 43, we hit the final topic of the chapter, and that is the place of foreigners in the assembly of Israel. And interestingly enough, I never see verse 43 brought up when churches want to have a Christian version of the Passover Seder. Did you catch the end of verse 43? There will no stranger eat of it. And in this case, stranger means foreigner, someone who is not born from one of the tribes of Israel. So for those people who want to take the Bible very literally, and that tends to be the ones who have Passover Seders in churches, it's a little bit culturally insensitive, but that's a different matter for a different day. They totally miss this verse where right here in Scripture it says no foreigner, no non-Jew should eat the Passover. Just stirring the pot a little bit there. Now, as we get into the instructions here, they can seem a little unnecessarily specific to us, but there's some useful insights we can get out of it. Like verse 44, we note that we already have expectations here that Israelites will own foreign slaves, suggesting that this passage was written at a later time when they did, because it says every man's slave that is bought for money when he has circumcised him can eat from the Passover. So Israelites did not have slaves as they were leaving Egypt, which means that this verse would make no sense being told to them at the time that they left. It is an anachronistic message showing that the author was writing from a time when Israelites did own foreign slaves. And verse 46, they are told not to break the bone. Now, I know a lot of Christians want to immediately jump to Jesus' crucifixion for this, but let's not look at that yet, because there was a significance to this in its own context. Breaking the bone likely refers to sucking out the marrow from the bone. Since this meal was to be eaten in haste, they wouldn't have had time to get out every last bit from the meal. Some Jewish commentators have even suggested that it was an indulgence. Just like rich people don't worry about leaving any meat on the bone, they have enough for another meal later on. They're not going to be worried about getting every last bit out of it. So now the Israelites are also rich as freed people. Personally, I find that interpretation a little less likely. However, the strange intricacies of the Passover have been subject to debate for millennia now. In fact, there was even an anti-Christian apologetic text from the 1200 CE called Sefer Nitzachon Yashon that had a stereotypical Christian berating Jews for not understanding the obscure details of this chapter, suggesting in his mind that the passage was obviously meant to be taken as a metaphor for Jesus, since no sense could be made of the literal commands to the Jewish people of Moses' day. And that then later led to Jewish writers doubling down on finding rationales for the literal meaning. So yes, it is true that there is reference later on in the New Testament to Jesus' bones not being broken, but the specific meaning in this original context was not a foreshadowing of Jesus as much as it was just a statement that they would not have time to break apart the bones and try to get the marrow out because they had to leave in haste. Note how verse 48 brings up circumcision again. So circumcision ends the Exodus proper story, just like Moses' individual story was ended by a rush circumcision of his son. Notice as well, as we're here in verse 48, that we are told a foreigner can eat the Passover so long as he and his sons are circumcised. Back in verse 43, we were told that no foreigners could eat the Passover. And here it says they can, they just have to have gone through the ritual of circumcision first. It doesn't say they had to become Jews, it doesn't say they had to convert. Rather, just so long as they were respecting the customs of the land they were in, they were welcome to join in, just like they were covenant members, even though they weren't. In fact, a later Targum, a Jewish commentary slash translation on these texts would go on to say that stranger should actually be translated apostate, meaning that anyone who wasn't intentionally antagonistic to the Jewish faith could participate in Passover. It also stated that the feast of Passover was welcome to anyone who was also willing to celebrate Yom Kippur with Jewish people. See, the time of Passover was seen as a festival, whereas Yom Kippur was a time of mourning and atonement. So later rabbis looked at this passage and interpreted it to mean that you couldn't just join in on the celebration of Passover as an outsider. You were more than welcome to do so, but you also had to participate in the once-a-year time of introspection and realignment with God, known as Yom Kippur. This passage is a great example of the complexity of Scripture and why we can't just throw around verses like proof texts and say, haha, I have a verse that says X thing, that proves I'm right. We have verse 43 that says, no one who's not a Jew can eat of this. No stranger, no foreigner, no Gentile can eat of the Passover. And then in verse 48, we have, oh yeah, sure, they can eat of it as long as they are respecting the tradition of circumcision. And then later Jewish tradition interprets that to mean anyone is willing to do this so long as they accept both the positive and the negative sides, both the times of feasting and the times of mourning. And verse 49 reads that one law will be to him who is homeborn and to the stranger that sojourns among you. And that word law is the word Torah, and that means teaching or instruction. So the verse means there will be one teaching, one instruction for people who are from our tribe as well as for people who are from other tribes. Or put more simply, no favoritism. Treat foreigners and immigrants as if they were your own. Don't make it harder on them. They already have it harder than you by nature of their being foreigners and immigrants. It means that they are coming from a different land. It means that they are in an uncomfortable place for them, a place that they are not used to, a people they are not used to, perhaps even language and customs that they are not used to. So don't make it harder on them. Treat them as if they were your own. Can you possibly think of any ways that that might apply to the world in which we live today? I will just pull the pin on that grenade and leave it there for you to think about. We have now made it through the first 12 chapters of Exodus, and unfortunately that is where our study of the book is going to end for the time being. I am sure we will be back in Exodus at a later time, but we do have other topics we have to get to before the end of the year. Hopefully through this study you have seen that the Exodus is not just a history text. Even today, it is a story about every situation where the powers that be claim that the way things are is the way they have to be. It's about recognizing that the God who rescued slaves from Egypt is still in the business of challenging systems that treat human beings as expendable even today. Whether you're Christian, Jewish, or just someone interested in stories that have shaped our world, the book of Exodus, and particularly this chapter 12 that we are in today, reminds us that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is gather around a table, get some good food, tell the old stories, and remember that present liberation for a better future is always possible. We started out with a baby in a basket crying by the Nile River, and we have watched over 12 chapters as that baby has grown into a man who would challenge the most powerful empire on earth. We have seen burning bushes and divine names, plagues and wonders, slavery and liberation. But here is what I want you to remember as we close out this series. Exodus 12 is not the end of the story. It's barely the beginning. The Israelites are about to spend 40 years wandering in the wilderness, learning what it truly means to be free. They're going to build a golden calf. They're going to complain about food, rebel against Moses, and, well, basically act like every group of humans who's ever lived. Freedom, it turns out, is harder than slavery at times. Slaves know what's expected of them. Freedom is unpredictable. The book of Exodus continues beyond this chapter, and so does the story it tells. Every generation has to decide whether they're going to live as free people or settle for what form of bondage feels familiar. Every community has to choose between scarcity thinking like Pharaoh and Egypt, or abundance thinking that brings us back to the Eden-like world that God wanted. Every individual has to decide whether they will trust that liberation is possible or accept that this is just the way things are. The mixed multitude that left Egypt that night, they're still with us. They're in every refugee camp, every immigrant community, every group of people that we have been told don't belong and are just riffraff. In every coalition of the unlikely and unwanted, every gathering of riffraff who dare to believe they deserve better. The Passover meal that began that night is still being celebrated. Jews around the world still gather every year to say, "We were slaves in Egypt and God brought us out with a mighty hand." But more than that, communities everywhere still gather around tables to remember their liberation stories, to pass them on to the next generation, and to insist that the arc of history must continue to bend toward justice. The God who heard the groaning of the slaves in Egypt is still hearing the groaning of the oppressed and abused today. The God who challenged Pharaoh's claim to ultimate authority is still challenging the systems that we create that treat human beings as expendable. The God who said, "Let my people go," is still saying it. The only question is he saying it about you or to you? The Exodus isn't ancient history. It's a template. It's a reminder that no empire lasts forever, no system of oppression is permanent, and no group of people is beyond hope. Whether you've been with us for the whole series or this is your first episode you've popped in on, I want to thank you for joining us on the journey. These ancient stories have so much to teach us about power and liberation, community and identity, and what it means to be human in a world that is often designed to crush the human spirit. And we do have one more episode coming in the series. It's going to be a question and response where I look through some of the questions that we have received of late. So if you have any questions about what we've covered, go ahead, send them our way now. You can always reach out on the homepage of our website via email, cconn@thebibleuncut.com, or comment on socials and Discord. But for now, remember this. You are not a slave to whatever Egypt is holding you captive. You are not powerless against whatever Pharaoh claims authority in your life. You are not alone in whatever wilderness you are wandering through, if I can spiritualize these passages for a moment. The God who split the sea is still in the business of making ways where there seems to be no way. The God who fed people with manna still provides what we need for our journeys. The God who gave instruction at Sinai is still calling communities into covenant with each other and with justice. So let's keep telling stories. Let's keep asking hard questions. Let's keep wrestling with difficult passages. Let's keep believing that liberation is possible. Let's keep making space at our tables for the mixed multitude. And remember, the story isn't over. It's never over. So until next time, stay curious and keep asking questions about the Uncut and Unfiltered Bible. You've been listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We hope we provided a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. If you enjoyed the podcast, would you take a minute to share it with a friend? You could also rate and review on your podcast app. If you'd like to donate to keep our work going, you can go to our website, thebibleuncut.com, and click on the Support Us tab. While you're there, check out the recommended resources and blog where we post show notes and other articles. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.